So I'll stop there. Happy to hear your thoughts and comments on these questions.
First of all, thank you so much for this talk. I had a question about other European countries dealing with COVID and their reception systems, because in Ireland, a lot of the focus has been on reforming the reception system because of unsuitable accommodation. And that was really a big problem for the coronavirus, because there's a lot of overcrowding in the reception centers. But I haven't heard much about other European countries and how they're dealing with it.
Great, thanks. And I think this raises also a very interesting point when it comes to COVID, that there were many negative effects on asylum and on asylum seekers' rights that resulted from COVID, but there were also a few positive changes. And one of them is actually improvement in reception conditions. So Ireland is not alone in having, I wouldn't say having used COVID because it's not as deliberate, but having been forced to improve some aspects of reception as a result of the COVID situation. We noted we got evidence on 13 EU member states where there were improvements in reception conditions that resulted from COVID, and there may have been more. Those were the ones where we found evidence. And the most obvious one, which still has a long way to go, is Greece, where the arrival of the virus also led to some improvements in the appalling, illegal reception conditions on the islands. I think the other thing to note with this is that in some cases, the improvement was that people were actually taken out of detention. So for many member states, unfortunately, a situation of de facto detention has prevailed, where asylum seekers, people at different processes, at different points in an asylum process, have been de facto detained, which is almost the worst scenario, because if it's a formal detention regime, then the person has certain rights to challenge the detention, to have access to lawyers, whatever. Whereas if it's informal de facto detention, they don't even have that. And some member states chose to ease their detention regimes. So for instance, Spain quite early on released quite a large number of people who'd been held in detention as a result of COVID. So that was one of the small, let's say long overdue, but still welcome changes.
I also have a question which concerns another country. I'm from France, and I'm working in a refugee center near Paris.
Oh.
And so I've worked with lots of people coming from Mauritania and Sudan or Congo, and I noticed that they all have a great ability to integrate into French society, but some of them also have a lot of trouble to integrate because they don't speak the language. And I've noticed as well that it's more the NGOs that actually help refugees or asylum seekers rather than government policies. So I was wondering, what integration programs do you propose to help refugees, and also encouraging governments to actually do something?
Yeah, I think that's a absolutely crucial question. And you saw in, I'll just flick back, hold on a second. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm clowning about with the, let me share the screen and come to here. If we're talking about our alternatives, from ECRE's perspective, we do a lot and we focus a lot on making asylum systems work, but just as important are these what we might call flanking measures. So safe and legal routes so that people can arrive without having to take traumatic journeys. And one thing you might have seen in that working in that centre is the level of trauma that people experience, particularly when they've travelled through dangerous routes, and including those coming up across the Sahel and into Libya, of course. And we see many people who have at some point been in Libya who've been tortured or subject to rape and so on. So I think that's also sort of part of the integration picture, is to open up legal routes, including for those with protection needs and those without. Then we talk about, as you can see in point 3 here, inclusion through rights, respect, and regularization. One of the reasons why we sort of emphasize those different elements is to try and avoid an approach to integration which is based on sort of preaching to people that they must accept European values, which unfortunately we hear sometimes from politicians. And actually people having their rights respected is the easiest way that for them to then integrate often. And we would highlight certain rights in particular, the right to housing. And in France, I mean, again, as you, I'm sure well know, that there's really a crisis at that level when it comes to decent accommodation. I mean, the reception system is you know, I don't know how to describe it, is catastrophique. And there, that, of course, hampers people's integration in multiple ways. The other right that we emphasize is the right to work. And the one of the other small positive developments that came from COVID was an expansion in the right to work in certain countries. So, for instance, here in Belgium, due to or various political factors that resulted from COVID, labour market shortages, asylum seekers were given the right to work from day one. And so, whereas it used to kick in at a later stage. And we would argue that every asylum seeker should have the right to work from the first point, because that most people want to work. Europe needs workers. The questions of competition with other categories of workers are largely mythical. So I think that right also is crucial. That the other point that we would emphasize, which I think is probably something that you saw in your work, is dedicated integration programs. And those programs often are delivered by NGOs, including many of our members who run such programs. And there you have basic things, daily life, how to get about, having somebody accompany you when you have to go to the prefecture or whatever it is. But also the question of language acquisition. Now, that varies a bit from country to country, because in some countries in Europe, you will be okay without the local language. In other countries, and France would be one, it would be difficult for people, if not impossible. So increasing and putting more resources there, I think is crucial. The other thing we emphasize is the involvement of refugee-led organizations themselves, because they can work on integration in a way that other organizations often can't. Knowledge of language, knowledge of culture, knowledge of communities, trust, all issues that we see. As a number of our members are refugee-led organizations, and you see immediately they just have a different relationship with communities. In terms of what can be done on that, one thing we advocate for here in Brussels is EU funding for integration. So the member states can choose how they spend their EU migration money. and a lot of them choose to spend it on return, which also then means it's spent on de facto detention, whereas we say earmark more money for integration and asylum systems. I'd make one final small remark on integration, which is a very worrying thing. When there was all this hostile debate about refugees and migrants in Europe, still there were people who would emphasize integration. So you had a typical discourse where we don't want more people to come, Europe can't cope, however, integration is essential. Unfortunately, now we see some countries that have policies that are basically anti-integration policies. And that might be a country like Hungary, which is obvious. We know that the extreme right, illiberal position of the Orban government. But it's also countries like Denmark, where they have a strong tradition of integration, but the current government was elected on a platform of no integration. So everybody there, whatever their status, from day one, their perspective should be return. And I think this will create massive social problems, as well as just being inhumane and unpleasant.
I would like to ask a few questions, if I may, and if no one
Sure.
else wants right now. So one touches upon the normative framework you mentioned, like rights, and I was thinking, are human rights approaches or frameworks we do have enough, or is that rather the need for like a capabilities approach? So is it about that people are aware about the rights, or that they do have the rights, or how to activate those rights? So that would be one question. And then another, when you talked about integration and inclusion and also participation, I thought, are our governments, like I'm from Germany, but generally the EU governments, are they failing in integrating other people's voices, like in form of like a more participatory approach? I do have the feeling that we're often framing refugees as either good or bad, like either they're the poor people or they're like the bad people, and our rates of criminality and everything are like increasing. But I do think that we're just talking about them instead of like integrating them into the discussion. So I was thinking about how can we move forward? Although we do know that often when it comes to fundraising, like I myself do fundraising in this regard, it's better to like stigmatize people as the poor people in terms of receiving money or donations. But I know that this is kind of against the dignity as well. So, yeah. Sorry.
I think those are both extremely interesting questions. On the first one, I would say, first of all, what we don't need is reform or additions to international law, or indeed to EU law. We have the international human rights law instruments and that as a legal framework. And we have international refugee law as a specialized area within that. And we all know that international refugee law are based on the convention and the protocol. In a way, it's not adequate because those were instruments designed a long time ago for particular purposes. But our concern is that if you open up the international legal framework, then it will only get worse. And this is exactly what we're seeing with EU asylum law, that we're not, we don't think the common European asylum system as it exists is perfect, far from it. But we wouldn't argue for reform because we know that with this political climate, if you open up a legal framework, then the countries use it to reduce standards. So operate within the law that we have. And then that takes us, I think, to your question, capabilities approach. Yes, all human rights work in practice is about access. It's about access to the rights that exist on paper, but are so hard to realize in practice. So the work that we do, I mentioned that one aspect of our work is litigation. I mean, it's supporting lawyers in their own litigation, representing individual clients, or it's strategic litigation. But the strategic cases are the same. It will be somebody whose rights have been denied, and then we're trying to get a decision in Strasbourg or Luxembourg that recognizes that and condemns that member state, either strikes down a law, condemns an action on the basis of it not being compliant with the European Convention on Human Rights or the Charter of Fundamental Rights of the EU, or other aspects of EU law. So I think it's all in this question of ensuring access to the rights that exist. And for a lot of our members, their work is about providing legal assistance. And it is all for that reason, because otherwise the rights such as they are sort of meaningless. And of course, states know this. I mean, there's a crackdown as part of the general crackdown and repression of civil society, but also the criminalization of some of the work that we do and other NGOs is based on preventing people working to access people's rights. So that might be even the question of the right to life. If you look at search and rescue, this big discussion, and it's not just a discussion, I mean, the battle, I would say, to prevent search and rescue ships operating is about denying people access to the right to life. And what NGOs have been doing, what we do, what our members do, where the state is not providing those rights, we sort of step into that space. And so you have a couple of years ago, there were 12 NGOs operating search and rescue in the Mediterranean, and that was a result of state-operated search and rescue being closed down. So I agree with you very much on that point. On the question of people's participation, inclusion, I think there's a lot of dilemmas that arise here. And clearly, as you put it very, very well, it's not a respect for people's dignity if we present them solely as victims, and because it's dehumanizing in a different way to the presenting people as threats, which is also dehumanizing, and all of it is damaging. I understand to some extent why some humanitarian organizations do it, because they think, well, we need the money. If we present these pictures of, you know, the whatever it may be, the drowning person at sea or the dead child, then we get money and then we can help people. But still, I think it creates too many ethical dilemmas. In our work, we try to include people with a refugee background at every level. But the most important thing has just been the internal inclusion. So on our board of directors, as staff members, as members of the network, in the way that any other organization would be a member of the network. And indeed, as staff members, we try to make it clear that these are people, the person is a policy officer, a project officer. They happen to have a refugee background, that's important, but trying not to sort of turn this into something that focuses on them in an inappropriate way. The same way at all our events, we try to have representation of people with a refugee background, but as experts, like any other expert on the panel, but with extra credibility, you could say, rather than being there to tell a story, for instance, which I think has the same trap and the same risks as presenting people purely as victims. So you see sometimes in conferences, there'll be somebody with a refugee background who tells a story of being on a boat and all that, and these kind of things, and they're reduced to that. And then a discussion among experts about EU policy will start. no, I mean, the person is invited to be in that same discussion. For ECRE, as for many other organisations, that's a work in progress, but I think it's also potentially a game changer, in the sense, if we want to change the narrative and the politics on this issue, we also need to have and give more space to people with a refugee background to contribute and discuss.
Thank you so much for that, Catherine. I just want to be mindful of the time we have. It's nearly 6 and nearly 7 for you, so I don't want to keep you much longer. But I think on behalf of everyone who's attended this talk, I can thank you so much for it, because it's been so enlightening and such an interesting talk. Yeah, I don't want us to get kicked off of this call.
No, my pleasure. Great to speak to you all, and thanks for your all your useful questions there at the end.